It looked like a perfect wedding, until experts noticed the bride's bouquet was made of deadly flowers, and what they uncovered next turned a love story into a chilling mystery that still hasn't been solved. In the summer of 1998, the small town of Briar Glen, Vermont, buzzed with excitement. It wasn't often that something as grand as a full-scale wedding took place there, and when Emily Carter announced her marriage to Daniel Hayes, it quickly became the talk of the town. Emily was well known in Briar Glen. She worked at the local library, had a soft voice, and was always seen helping others. People described her as kind, thoughtful, and a little reserved. Daniel, on the other hand, was newer to town. He had moved there just over a year earlier and worked in construction. He was charming, confident, and seemed deeply devoted to Emily, at least on the surface. The wedding took place on a warm June afternoon at a countryside estate just outside town. The venue was surrounded by tall oak trees, open fields, and a quiet stillness that made everything feel almost cinematic. White chairs were arranged neatly on the grass, and soft music played as guests took their seats. Everything looked perfect. Emily walked down the aisle in a classic white lace gown. Her veil caught the sunlight, creating a soft glow around her face. But some guests would later recall that her smile didn't quite reach her eyes. It was subtle, something you could easily miss, but it was there. Daniel stood waiting at the altar, smiling proudly. He looked calm, composed, and completely in control. When their eyes met, he gave her a reassuring nod, as if everything was exactly as it should be. The ceremony itself was simple and elegant. Vows were exchanged, rings were placed, and the crowd applauded as the couple was declared husband and wife. Cameras flashed, capturing every moment. Among all those photographs, one image stood out, though no one realized it at the time. It was taken shortly after the ceremony, away from the crowd. Emily stood alone beneath an old oak tree at the edge of the property. The sunlight filtered through the leaves above her, casting soft shadows across her face. She held her bouquet gently in both hands. At first glance, it looked like a peaceful, almost dreamy portrait. But there was something unusual about it. Emily's expression was different from the rest of the photos. Instead of smiling brightly, she looked distant, almost lost in thought. Her eyes weren't focused on the camera but seemed to be looking past it, as if she was searching for something, or someone. The photographer later claimed it was one of his favorite shots from the day. He described it as natural and honest. He didn't try to pose her or adjust her stance. He simply captured the moment as it was. And then there was the bouquet. It was made up of delicate white flowers, carefully arranged and tied with a satin ribbon. At the time, no one questioned it. It looked elegant, unique even. Just another detail in a beautifully planned wedding. After the ceremony, the celebration moved into full swing. Guests laughed, toasted, and filled the evening with music and dancing. Emily and Daniel appeared happy, cutting the cake together, sharing their first dance, and posing for more photographs. But a few small moments stood out to those who remembered. Emily seemed quieter than usual. She spoke less, smiled politely, and often glanced toward Daniel as if waiting for his approval. Daniel, meanwhile, stayed close to her almost constantly. He answered questions on her behalf, guided her through conversations, and rarely let her out of his sight. At the time, it was easy to dismiss. Weddings can be overwhelming. Brides can be nervous. Nothing seemed serious enough to raise concern. As the night came to an end, the couple prepared to leave for their honeymoon. Guests gathered outside, throwing rice and cheering as Emily and Daniel walked hand in hand toward their car. It was the last time anyone in Briar Glen would see them. The next morning, their house remained empty. Days passed with no word. At first, people assumed they were enjoying an extended honeymoon. But as weeks turned into silence, concern grew. Calls went unanswered. Letters were returned. Eventually, the truth became impossible to ignore. Emily Carter and Daniel Hayes had vanished without a trace. The investigation that followed found no signs of struggle, no clear evidence, and no explanation. It was as if the couple had simply stepped out of their lives and disappeared into thin air. And so, the wedding album was packed away. The photographs, once symbols of joy, became painful reminders of a mystery no one could solve. Except for that one photo. The one beneath the oak tree. The one with the bouquet. Because years later, when someone finally looked closer, they would realize. The answers had been there all along. Nearly 2 decades after Emily Carter and Daniel Hayes vanished, the memory of their wedding had faded into a quiet local mystery, one of those stories people mentioned only in passing, often followed by a shrug and the words, "No one ever found out what happened." But in 2017, that silence was broken. Claire Donovan had come to Briar Glen for a completely different reason. A historian specializing in archival preservation, she had been hired to help organize old town records, personal collections, and donated materials that had been sitting untouched in the local historical society for years. Her work was usually routine, sorting documents, cataloging photographs, and preserving fragile items from decay. She wasn't looking for a mystery. She found one anyway. It happened on a quiet afternoon while she was reviewing a set of family albums donated by a former resident. Among them was a worn, leather-bound book labeled simply, Carter Hayes Wedding, June 1998. Claire opened it with mild curiosity. The first few pages showed exactly what she expected: smiling guests, decorated tables, a glowing bride and groom. The images felt warm and ordinary, like countless wedding albums she had seen before. But then she turned the page. And everything changed. There it was, the photograph. Emily stood beneath the oak tree, holding her bouquet. The lighting was soft, almost too perfect. But Claire's attention didn't go to Emily's face at first. It went straight to the flowers. Claire leaned closer, her brow tightening slightly. Something about the arrangement didn't sit right with her. Years of studying botanical symbolism had trained her eye to recognize not just plants, but their meaning. She carefully lifted the photo and examined it under better light. The bouquet wasn't random. It was deliberate. Claire identified the first flower almost instantly: white asphodel. It was rare, especially in modern bouquets, and historically associated with death and the afterlife. In ancient traditions, it was believed to grow in the fields of the dead. Her expression grew more serious. Next, she noticed foxglove, beautiful, bell-shaped flowers often used in ornamental gardens. But Claire knew their darker side. Foxglove contains digitalis, a compound that can affect the heart and become lethal in the wrong dose. And then there was oleander. Claire felt a chill run through her. Oleander was not just symbolic, it was dangerously toxic. Every part of the plant, from its petals to its leaves, could be deadly if ingested. Even handling it without care could cause irritation. She sat back slowly, the photograph still in her hands. This wasn't a wedding bouquet. This was something else entirely. Claire's mind began to race. Why would a bride carry such flowers on her wedding day? It didn't make sense, not culturally, not traditionally, and certainly not accidentally. Someone had chosen these flowers. And they had chosen them for a reason. At first, Claire considered the possibility of artistic expression. Some florists experimented with unusual arrangements. But the combination she was looking at wasn't just unusual, it was specific. Each flower carried a meaning tied to death, danger, or poison. It felt intentional. Like a message. Claire flipped back through the album, studying other photos more closely now. She noticed that the bouquet appeared in several shots, always the same, always prominent. No one else seemed to react to it. No one appeared concerned. Which meant either no one recognized the flowers, or no one thought to question them. Claire decided she couldn't ignore it. The next day, she brought the photograph to a colleague who specialized in plant taxonomy. Without giving any background, she simply asked him to identify the flowers. His response confirmed her fears. "White asphodel, foxglove, and oleander," he said, glancing up at her. "That's an odd combination. Beautiful, but not something you'd want to keep around too long." "Why?" Claire asked, though she already knew the answer. "Because 2 of those are highly toxic," he replied. "And the third isn't exactly associated with happy occasions." That was all Claire needed. She contacted local authorities and presented her findings. At first, there was hesitation. The case was old, nearly forgotten. But the unusual nature of the bouquet, and Claire's expertise, was enough to spark interest. The investigation was reopened. Detectives retrieved the original case files, dusting off reports that hadn't been touched in years. They re-examined photographs, interviewed surviving witnesses, and began piecing together a timeline that had long gone cold. And at the center of it all was the bouquet. Claire couldn't shake the feeling that it was more than just a strange detail. The more she thought about it, the more it seemed like a silent warning hidden in plain sight. But a warning for who? For Emily? Or about someone else entirely? As investigators dug deeper, one thing became clear. That wedding had not been as perfect as it seemed. And the truth, whatever it was, had been hiding in that photograph all along, waiting for someone with the right eye to finally see it. Once Claire Donovan's findings reached the authorities, the quiet town of Briar Glen was shaken once again. A case that had long been buried under dust and silence was suddenly alive. Detectives reopened files, reviewed old witness statements, and pulled out every photograph from the Carter Hayes wedding. But this time, they weren't looking for obvious clues. They were looking for something hidden. The bouquet became the center of attention. Investigators enlarged images, studying every petal, every stem, every angle in which Emily held it. The more they examined it, the clearer it became, this was no accident. The arrangement had been carefully designed. It wasn't just unusual, it was intentional, almost like a coded message placed in plain sight. But a message from who? And for what purpose? To answer that, detectives needed to go back to the beginning. They started by tracking down the wedding vendors, photographer, caterer, venue staff, and most importantly, the florist. Many years had passed, but a surprising number of people were still alive and able to recall fragments of that day. Most interviews followed a familiar pattern. "It was a beautiful wedding," one guest said. "Emily seemed a little quiet, but that's normal," another added. "Daniel was charming. Very attentive," someone else recalled. Nothing stood out, until they asked about the flowers. That's when the tone began to shift. Several guests admitted they hadn't paid much attention at the time, but now that it was mentioned, they remembered the bouquet being different. One woman described it as strange but elegant. Another said it felt a little too serious for a wedding. Still, no one had questioned it back then. The florist, however, that was a different story. Her name was Margaret Bell. At first, investigators assumed locating her would be simple. She had run a small floral business in a nearby town at the time of the wedding. But when they searched for her records, they found something unsettling. Margaret Bell had disappeared. Just months after Emily and Daniel's wedding, her business had closed abruptly. There were no forwarding details, no contact information, and no trace of her in the years that followed. It was as if she had stepped out of existence. This discovery raised immediate suspicion. Why would a florist vanish so suddenly after working on a wedding that later became a missing persons case? Digging deeper, investigators uncovered even more troubling information. Margaret Bell hadn't always been a florist. Before opening her shop, she had worked as a nurse. At first glance, that didn't seem unusual. But when detectives pulled her employment records, they found a disturbing detail. She had been dismissed from her position after a patient died under unclear circumstances. The case had never led to charges, but questions had remained unanswered. Now, with her connection to the toxic bouquet, those questions returned with force. Attention quickly shifted to Daniel Hayes. When investigators re-examined his background, they noticed details that had been overlooked years earlier. Financial records showed he had been struggling before the wedding: debts, missed payments, and increasing pressure from creditors. Then came the most alarming discovery. Just weeks before the wedding, Daniel had taken out a life insurance policy on Emily. The payout was substantial. Enough to erase his debts, and more. Suddenly, the picture began to change. What once seemed like a romantic wedding now looked like something carefully staged. Detectives began to consider a chilling possibility: what if the wedding wasn't a celebration at all? What if it was part of a plan? To test this theory, they returned to the wedding timeline. Every detail was re-examined: the ceremony, the reception, the interactions between guests. They searched for anything that might have seemed unusual at the time but had been dismissed. That's when a small but important detail surfaced. A former guest, now living out of state, recalled a brief conversation with Emily on the wedding day. At the time, it hadn't seemed significant. But now, years later, it felt different. "She asked me something strange," the woman said during her interview. "She asked if I thought flowers could have meanings, like hidden meanings." The detective paused. "What did you say?" "I told her yes, some do. But I thought she was just making conversation." She hesitated before adding, "Now I'm not so sure." This changed everything. If Emily herself had been questioning the meaning of the flowers, then maybe she had noticed something. Maybe she had sensed that something wasn't right. The idea that the bouquet was a warning, not just a symbol, began to take shape. But if it was a warning, who was trying to send it? And why didn't it work? As investigators connected these pieces, one truth became impossible to ignore. This wasn't just a disappearance. It was something far more calculated. And somewhere within that wedding, hidden behind smiles, music, and celebration, was a secret no one had fully understood. Until now. As the investigation deepened, the theory that had once seemed unthinkable began to feel disturbingly plausible. What if Emily and Daniel's wedding had not been the beginning of a happy life, but the final step in a carefully constructed plan? Detectives approached the case with fresh eyes, treating it not as a disappearance, but as a potential crime that had been hidden behind celebration and tradition. Daniel Hayes quickly became the central focus. At first, he had appeared to be a loving husband, attentive, calm, and devoted. But as investigators revisited witness statements and compared them with new findings, a different picture began to emerge. Several guests recalled how closely Daniel had stayed by Emily's side throughout the wedding. At the time, it had been seen as affectionate. Now, it felt controlling. "He never let her out of his sight," one guest said. "If someone asked her a question, he would often answer first." Another remembered how Emily seemed hesitant during conversations, as if she was choosing her words carefully. "It was subtle," the guest explained. "But she didn't seem relaxed." These small details, once dismissed, now carried weight. Detectives then turned their attention to the reception itself. The venue owner, who had kept a few items from past events as personal mementos, still had a box labeled, "Carter Hayes Wedding." Inside were leftover decorations, a copy of the seating chart, and something unexpected. A teacup. It had been part of the set used at the head table, where Emily and Daniel had sat during the reception. The owner explained that it had been accidentally packed away after the event and never returned. At the time, it had seemed insignificant. Now, it became critical evidence. The cup was sent for testing. When the results came back, they confirmed what investigators had begun to suspect. Traces of a toxic substance were found. The compound, though degraded over time, showed characteristics consistent with plant-based poisons, similar to those found in foxglove and oleander. The same types of plants that had been identified in Emily's bouquet. The connection was impossible to ignore. This wasn't coincidence. It was design. Detectives began to reconstruct what might have happened that day. According to witness accounts, Daniel had personally handed Emily a cup of herbal tea during the reception. Several guests remembered him mentioning that it would help calm her nerves. At the time, it had seemed thoughtful. Now, it looked like something else entirely. If Emily had consumed even a small amount of poison, the symptoms might not have appeared immediately. Depending on the dosage, it could take hours before she felt ill, long enough for the couple to leave the wedding unnoticed. This detail aligned with what happened next. After the reception, Emily and Daniel departed for their honeymoon. No one reported seeing anything unusual. There were no signs of distress, no visible arguments, no reason to suspect anything was wrong. But if Emily had already been poisoned, then the honeymoon may never have truly begun. Investigators traced the couple's planned route. They were supposed to travel to a quiet lakeside cabin several hours away, a location chosen, according to earlier records, for its privacy. But when authorities searched the area years later, they found no official check-in records, no witnesses, and no evidence that the couple had ever arrived. It was as if they had vanished somewhere along the way. This raised a chilling possibility. What if Daniel had never intended to reach the destination at all? What if the journey itself was part of the plan? With Emily weakened, or worse, Daniel could have staged their disappearance anywhere along the route. A remote area, a wooded region, a place where no one would think to look. The more investigators explored this theory, the more it made sense. But one element still didn't fit. Margaret Bell. If Daniel had planned everything so carefully, what was her role? Was she an accomplice, or something else? The toxic flowers suggested involvement. Her background as a nurse pointed to knowledge. And her sudden disappearance raised even more suspicion. But there were inconsistencies. If she had been helping Daniel, why include a bouquet that was so symbolic, so noticeable to someone with the right expertise? Why risk drawing attention? Unless that had been the point. Detectives began to consider a different possibility. What if Margaret Bell had not been fully aligned with Daniel? What if she had known something and tried to intervene? This idea introduced a new layer to the case. Perhaps the bouquet was not just part of the plan, but an attempt to disrupt it. A silent warning placed in Emily's hands. If that were true, it meant there had been tension behind the scenes, something unseen by guests, hidden beneath the surface of the wedding. And if Margaret had tried to stop Daniel, what had happened to her? By the end of this stage of the investigation, one thing was clear. The wedding had not been what it seemed. It was no longer just a missing persons case. It was a carefully staged event, filled with hidden signals, quiet control, and a plan that had almost worked perfectly. Almost. Because something had gone wrong. And whatever that was, it had changed everything. By the time investigators reached the final stage of the reopened case, the story had already taken a dark and complicated turn. What began as a simple disappearance had evolved into something far more unsettling, a web of intention, silence, and hidden warnings. But the most important piece of the puzzle had yet to be found. And when it finally surfaced, it changed everything. The breakthrough came from an unexpected place. During a routine search of old property records, investigators discovered a storage unit registered under the name Margaret Bell. The unit had been inactive for years, its rental payments long overdue. It had likely been forgotten, just another abandoned space filled with discarded belongings. With legal permission, authorities opened it. Inside, they found boxes of documents, old clothing, and several personal items. At first glance, nothing seemed unusual. But as they sorted through the contents, one small, sealed envelope caught their attention. It was labeled simply, "If anything happens." The handwriting was neat, careful, almost deliberate. The envelope was opened. Inside was a letter. And in that letter, Margaret Bell told her story. She began by describing how she had been hired for the wedding. At first, it was just another job, nothing special. But when she met Daniel Hayes, something about him unsettled her. She couldn't explain it clearly, but she felt it strongly enough to pay closer attention. According to the letter, Margaret had overheard a conversation days before the wedding. Daniel had been speaking on the phone, his tone low and serious. She hadn't intended to listen, but certain words caught her attention. Words like timing, dose, and after the ceremony. Margaret wrote that her instincts, sharpened from years in the medical field, told her something was wrong. She began to observe Daniel more carefully, noticing small details others might have ignored, his precise behavior, his control over Emily, and the way he avoided being questioned too deeply. Then came the moment that confirmed her fears. Margaret claimed she discovered substances among Daniel's belongings, plant extracts and compounds she recognized as toxic. It was enough to convince her that he was planning something dangerous. Something deliberate. But instead of going to the authorities, she made a decision that would shape everything that followed. She decided to stay involved. Margaret believed that if she stayed close, she might be able to stop whatever Daniel was planning. She agreed to prepare the bouquet, but she chose the flowers carefully. The white asphodel. The foxglove. The oleander. Not as weapons, but as a message. In her letter, she explained her thinking. I hoped someone would notice. I hoped someone would understand what I was trying to say without me having to speak it aloud. She feared that confronting Daniel directly before the wedding would push him to act sooner, or worse, make her a target. So she chose a quieter approach, one that relied on someone else seeing what she saw. But no one did. The wedding went ahead as planned. Margaret wrote that she watched closely throughout the day, waiting for an opportunity to intervene. She noticed Daniel giving Emily the tea. She suspected it had been poisoned, but she couldn't prove it in that moment. So she made another decision. She followed them. According to the letter, Margaret left shortly after the reception and tracked the couple's route toward their supposed honeymoon destination. She intended to confront Daniel when they were alone, away from the crowd, where she could finally expose him without risking immediate danger. What happened next was less clear. Margaret's writing became less steady, as if she had been under stress while recording the events. She described reaching a remote stretch of road late at night. There, she spotted their car parked near a wooded area. The scene was quiet, too quiet. When she approached, she realized something was wrong. Emily was nowhere to be seen. Daniel was alone. Margaret confronted him. She wrote that she accused him directly, telling him she knew about the poison, the plan, everything. For a moment, she believed she had control of the situation. But she had underestimated him. Daniel didn't deny it. Instead, according to the letter, he admitted everything, calmly, almost coldly. He revealed that Emily had already fallen ill and that his plan had been carefully timed. Then, he said something that terrified Margaret. He told her she had made a mistake by getting involved. The final part of the letter was fragmented, the sentences shorter, more urgent. Margaret wrote that she tried to leave, to get help, but Daniel stopped her. What followed was not described in detail, but the implication was clear: the confrontation had turned violent. The last line of the letter read, I tried to save her. But he realized I knew. After that, none of us were safe. There was nothing else. No signature. No date beyond a rough estimate. Just silence. Investigators were left with more answers, but also more questions. What exactly had happened on that road? Had Emily already died before Margaret arrived? Or had she still been alive, somewhere nearby? What became of Margaret after the confrontation? And most importantly, what happened to Daniel Hayes? Despite renewed searches and deeper investigations, no bodies were ever found. No confirmed sightings were reported. The case, even with its new revelations, remained unresolved. But one thing was certain now. The wedding had never been what it seemed. It had been a carefully staged moment hiding a dangerous plan, and a desperate attempt to stop it. And that photograph, the one beneath the oak tree, was no longer just a memory. It was evidence. A silent message captured in time. A warning that had gone unnoticed. Until it was too late.